Welcome back to the deep dive. We're sorting through the sources you sent, looking at one of history's most, well, striking military moments. Today, we're getting into the Battle of Agincourt, October 25th, 1415. The story around this battle is almost legendary, isn't it? You can see why. We've got this English army led by King Henry V. They weren't just tired, they were sick. Dysentery was rife after that tough siege at Harfleur. They're trying to get back to Calais, but they're massively outnumbered, maybe 4-1, some sources say, and then bam, they run into this huge French force. The odds just looked impossible.
Utterly impossible, on paper at least. And that's our mission today, really, to look past the myth and figure out the mechanics. How did Henry V pull this off? We're going to break down three main things. The terrain, which was huge, the English tactics, and the leadership contrast.
Right. So we're not just telling the story again. We want to pinpoint those moments, those decisions by Henry, and maybe the weaknesses on the French side that somehow canceled out their numbers advantage. Okay, let's start with that sheer desperation. When the English got near Agincourt, they were in a bad way. Sources suggest maybe only 6,000 or 7,000 men left. And like you said, not just tired, but sick. Harfleur had really cost them.
That's a really crucial point. It wasn't just marching fatigue. It was illness. Dysentery seriously weakened them. Fewer men, and the men they had were less, effective. So when they lined up for battle, it was because they absolutely had to. Their escape route was blocked by maybe 25,000 French soldiers, maybe more. And this really highlights Henry V's leadership, doesn't it? He put himself right in the center, commanding, encouraging, and the sources say he actually fought hand-to-hand with his men later on.
Wow.
Yeah, that kind of leadership, being right there in the danger. That's exactly what an exhausted, outnumbered army needs. It really focuses everyone.
And then you look across the field. The French leadership situation was, completely different. Not because they weren't brave, but the structure was just messy.
Precisely. Officially, Constable Charles d'Albret was in command, along with other big names, dukes and counts. But the key figure missing was the king himself, Charles VI. They called him Charles the Beloved, but also Charles the Mad. He was having severe bouts of mental illness.
Right, the Mad King period, so he couldn't lead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So command sort of fell to this council of nobles. Now, the constable, d'Albret, he's technically the top military guy under the king, but in that feudal system, he's trying to coordinate with all these powerful dukes who think they should be in charge or at least have a major say. So you get arguments, disagreements, overconfidence too. They were apparently squabbling over who would get the honor of leading the charge.
Not exactly strategic planning then.
Not at all. And that lack of unified command, that sort of internal competition, it hints right away at the problems they'd face tactically.
So one unified, desperate English king versus a divided, overconfident group of French nobles. And then the battlefield itself enters the equation. Okay, so how did they actually stop the French? If they were outnumbered maybe 4-1, how did they avoid just being swamped? You mentioned the terrain and the arrows, of course. But the ground itself was key.
Absolutely essential. Henry V couldn't have picked a better spot if he designed it himself, given his situation. The battle took place on this patch of recently plowed farmland right between two big woods.
Yeah.
The Tramcourt Wood and the Agincourt Wood.
Ah, so it narrowed the battlefield.
Exactly. It created a natural funnel. The French had this massive army, but they couldn't spread out and use their numbers. They were forced into this relatively narrow space between the trees, so that 4-1 advantage across the whole army. At the actual point of fighting, it might have been closer to 2-1, maybe even less. The rest of the French army was just sort of stuck behind, waiting.
And then came the rain. We always hear about the Agincourt mud, but it sounds like it was truly paralyzing.
Oh, completely. It had been raining heavily for days. That plowed field turned into this thick, sticky mud bath, a real quagmire. Now, picture the main French attack force. Thousands of knights and men-at-arms in full plate armor. That stuff is heavy, 50, 60 pounds, easily.
Right.
Try charging or even just walking briskly through deep mud wearing all that weight. Your protection suddenly becomes this massive burden. They just couldn't move effectively. They slowed right down, lost formation, started bunching up in that narrow funnel. It became less of a charge and more of a slow, exhausting slog.
Like wading through treacle in medieval armor. They must have been exhausted before they even reached the English line.
Precisely. They were becoming easy targets, vulnerable.
And that's where Henry's main weapon comes in the longbowman. Almost 80% of his army, you said? That's a huge bet on archery.
A massive commitment. And it wasn't just shooting arrows randomly. There was a system, a layered defense.
Layered how?
Well, before the French even got close, Henry had his archers hammer sharpened stakes into the ground in front of them. angled outwards.
Ah, like a makeshift fence?
Kind of, yeah. Palings, they were called. Designed to break up a cavalry charge, basically, to stop horses, or at least channel them away from the archers.
Clever. So stakes first, then the mud.
And then the arrows. Once the French infantry, the dismounted knights and men-at-arms were struggling in the mud, packed together in that funnel, that's when the longbows really did their damage. These guys could shoot maybe 10, 12 arrows a minute. Compare that to maybe 1 or 2 for a French crossbowman.
Huge difference in firepower.
Enormous. And they weren't just aiming at individuals, they were pouring arrows into this dense, struggling mass of men who couldn't really move or get out of the way. The casualties were horrific.
So the French numbers actually worked against them in that terrain. They became a bigger, denser target.
Exactly. Agincourt is just this classic example, isn't it? A smaller, well-led force uses the environment and the right technology, the longbow, and those simple stakes to completely neutralize a much larger enemy that was stuck using older tactics in the wrong place.
The main fighting, the sources suggest, might have been over relatively quickly, maybe half an hour for that first disastrous French wave. But the results were devastating for France. Thousands killed, compared to maybe a few hundred English losses. The imbalance is just staggering.
It is, but the numbers alone don't capture the full impact. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the really crippling thing for France wasn't just how many died, but who died.
Right, the nobility.
Exactly. A huge portion of the French high nobility was wiped out. Dukes, counts, the constable himself, other major officials, killed or captured. This wasn't just a military loss. It was like cutting the head off the French political and social structure. You lose that many leaders, landowners, administrators all at once.
Yeah.
It creates a massive power vacuum.
And practical problems too, I imagine, like collecting taxes or raising new armies when the local lord is dead or captured.
Absolutely. Huge ransoms were demanded for the captured nobles, draining wealth from France. It destabilized the entire kingdom, not just militarily, but politically and economically too.
So this one battle basically cleared the path for England to dominate for a while.
It certainly paved the way. Henry V followed up Agincourt with successful campaigns, especially in Normandy, consolidating English control.
And this all leads eventually to that famous treaty, doesn't it? The Treaty of Troy.
Yes, in 1420. And that treaty is the ultimate political consequence stemming directly from the disaster at Agincourt. It recognized Henry V as the regent of France and the heir to the French throne, effectively disinheriting the Dauphin, the French king's son.
Incredible. How could they agree to that?
Well, think about it. The French ruling class was decimated, demoralized. Charles VI was still incapacitated. They were in such a weakened state after Agincourt and the campaigns that followed, they had little leverage. Agreeing to the treaty, humiliating as it was, seemed like the only option to some. It raises that fascinating question. How does one battle, really a tactical victory snatched from the jaws of defeat by a sick army, end up potentially handing over the crown of France?
The answer seems to be by killing off almost everyone who mattered on the other side in a single afternoon.
It sounds brutal, but that's pretty much the strategic impact of those concentrated losses among the aristocracy. Hashtag outro.
So let's wrap up this deep dive into Agincourt. The key things for you to take away, I think, are that combination of factors. You had Henry V's leadership unified, present, determined. You had smart tactics, those stakes, the massed longbows. And critically, you had the terrain, that muddy funnel between the woods, turning the French strength into a weakness.
Right. And it's a story that lasts, partly because Shakespeare immortalized it, of course. It became this touchstone of English identity, the underdog victory. But the real lasting significance was perhaps more structural, more profound than just the battle itself. And, maybe a provocative thought for you to consider after this. Forget the military tactics for a second. How much did losing such a huge chunk of its ruling class, all those dukes, counts, knights in one, go fundamentally alter France's social and political path for decades? When you remove that much inherited power, land, and wealth, either through death or crippling ransom demands, what does that do to the fabric of a kingdom long term? That kind of deep societal impact, that political void, maybe that's the deepest legacy of Agincourt, beyond the arrows and the mud.
Really makes you think. A truly fascinating slice of history. We hope this deep dive helped clarify how such an unlikely victory happened. Join us next time.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are heading back to northern France, specifically October 1415. Agincourt, exactly. We're going to dissect one of military history's, most famous upsets, really.
A classic underdog story on the surface.
Right. You know the basics. Henry V of England, way outnumbered, His army's sick, starving, facing this huge French army, the absolute peak of chivalry.
Ready to crush them.
Should have been a walkover, according to, well, pretty much everyone at the time. But the sources we've looked at, they tell a different story about how it went down. So our mission today, it isn't just retelling the battle. We want to do a real deep dive into the sources, the analysis that explains how this tiny English force pulled it off.
It's about looking past the sort of romantic image of the lone, heroic archer.
Yes, it was a system. We need to unpack the tactical recipe. The longbow was key, obviously, but its success was all about how it was used.
That's exactly it. The sources really frame it as a victory of, let's say, military systems thinking, not just brute force or numbers. The longbow itself wasn't magic. Its effectiveness came from three main things working together. You had centuries of mandatory, really tough physical training.
Right.
You had the specific, frankly, terrifying characteristics of the weapon. And then critically, you had this brilliant, almost cynical tactical deployment that used the environment perfectly.
You have to look at the whole picture.
From the bowstring right down to the mud on the ground.
Okay, let's start with the people then. The sheer human effort involved. Because Henry's army specialization, it just leaps out from the sources. He's got, what, about 7,000 men total?
Roughly, yeah.
And maybe 5,000 of them?
Yeah.
It's a massive chunk.
We're longbowmen.
A huge concentration of specific skill set. You wouldn't see that kind of ratio elsewhere, really.
And using that weapon, it wasn't like picking up a rifle today. It was a lifelong commitment, physically. These bows were huge, 6, sometimes 7 feet long. And the draw weight, and the sources mention, figures routinely over 100 pounds, some say up to 160. It's physically staggering. I mean, when you look at the archaeology, the skeletal remains of these archers.
You can actually see it.
Oh, yeah. The sources and the bones themselves tell a story. These guys had bodies literally changed by their job. In large muscle attachments, bone spurs, often one arm significantly more developed than the other.
Wow.
Because of the immense repetitive force, pulling 120 pounds back hundreds of times a day, maybe thousands in battle. Think about pulling the equivalent of a small bag of cement back to your ear over and over.
Every shot.
Every single shot. The archer was the engine for the weapon system, and you didn't build that engine overnight.
So this incredible strength wasn't just like a few strong guys.
Yeah.
It was baked into the culture, legally enforced.
Precisely. You trace it back through centuries of English law. Archery wasn't just, a fun hobby. It was mandatory.
Mandatory.
Yeah. Compulsory training, often required by law for males from quite a young age. Sundays after church, target practice, not other sports.
So they built this national pool of highly specialized soldiers over generations.
Exactly. Something the French, who tended to rely more on their aristocratic knights and mercenary crossbowmen, they just didn't have in the same way.
Okay, so you've got these incredibly strong, highly trained archers. What did that buy Henry on the actual day? It wasn't just the power, was it? It was the speed, too.
The rate of fire. That's the real kicker, and it links directly back to the training and the bow design.
Compared to what the French had.
While the French often used crossbows, very powerful, yes, but slow. You had to crank them mechanically. A crossbowman might get, maybe 1 or 2 shots off a minute, if they're good.
Okay, and the longbowman.
Your skilled English longbowmen, the sources suggest, could manage 10 to 12 aimed arrows per minute. Some claim even more in short bursts.
10 to 12 versus 1 or 2.
It's a seismic difference. Now multiply that. You've got 5,000 archers potentially losing, maybe 50,000 arrows a minute at the peak.
A literal storm of arrows. Just unbelievable.
It creates a beaten zone unlike anything else on a medieval battlefield.
And they weren't just standard arrows, were they? I remember reading about specific arrowheads.
That's right. The sources mention specialized types, particularly the bodkin point.
What's that?
It's a narrow, hardened steel spike. Unlike a broadhead you'd use for hunting, which cuts, the bodkin is designed purely for penetration. To concentrate all that kinetic energy from a 100-plus pound bow onto a tiny point.
To get through armor.
To get through mail, certainly, and potentially find gaps or even punch through thinner plate armor, especially at closer ranges. So the combination high draw weight, velocity, specialized arrowhead meant French armor wasn't the guaranteed protection they thought.
Okay, so you have this devastating weapon system, high rate of fire, armor-piercing potential, but the French still massively outnumbered them, and they had heavy cavalry of the knights. Henry's big problem must have been stopping that charge from just rolling right over his archers.
Exactly, and that's where we move from the weapon itself to the battlefield engineering. The English solution was incredibly effective and pretty brutal. Pointed stakes.
Palisade, right?
Yes. The sources describe how the archers hammered these sharpened wooden stakes, maybe 6 feet long, into the ground, angled outwards towards the French.
Creating a barrier.
A temporary but very nasty barrier, like a giant hedgehog or porcupine defense right in front of the archers.
That's brilliant, really. Such a simple, low-tech solution. But what did it actually do to the French attack? It wasn't just protection, was it?
No, it had two crucial effects. First, the obvious one. Deterrence. Horses aren't stupid. They won't charge headlong into a wall of spikes. So the French cavalry had to stop or try to go around, losing all their momentum.
Okay.
But the second effect, the really clever one, was about controlling the battlefield geometry.
How so?
By planting these stakes, particularly on the flanks of their archer formations, the English basically funneled the French attack. They forced the huge French army, especially the knights charging on foot or horseback, into narrower lanes of approach.
Bottlenecks.
Exactly. They couldn't spread out and use their numbers. They were channeled right into the killing zones where the English archers could concentrate their fire. The English dictated where the fight would happen.
And this tactic, this smart use of stakes, it was amplified by the battlefield itself, wasn't it? There was the weather, the terrain.
Oh, absolutely. The terrain at Agincourt was almost like another weapon for the English. You see, the battlefield itself was quite narrow, hemmed in by dense woods on both sides.
So no room to flank.
Very little. The French basically had to come straight on. But the real killer, the thing every account mentions, was the ground condition.
The mud.
The mud. It had been raining heavily for days beforehand. That narrow field between the woods, it was churned into this deep, sticky, heavy morass.
Like plowland after a downpour.
Worse, probably. Knee-deep in places, apparently. Now imagine you're a French knight. You're wearing maybe 60, 70, 80 pounds of plate armor.
Heavy gear.
And you're trying to advance, maybe charge through that thick, clinging mud. Every step is exhausting. You're sinking, slipping.
So the perfect storm, really. The English tactics and the environment working together.
Precisely. Here's where it all comes together to create this perfect killing zone. You've got the French forces funneled by the stakes in the woods.
Packed together.
Packed densely together. They're slowed dramatically by the mud, exhausting themselves just trying to move forward. Their main advantages, numbers, and the shock of a heavy charge are completely negated.
And walking right into
that relentless storm of arrows we talked about. 10, 12 arrows per minute per archer. Thousands upon thousands raining down.
at relatively close range because the French advance was so slow.
Exactly. The result, according to the sources, was just devastating chaos. The heavy armor meant to protect actually became a death trap in the mud.
How so?
Well, men were falling, unable to get up easily because of the weight and the mire. They presented huge, slow-moving targets. The arrow volleys caused immediate casualties, wounded horses, and just sheer terror and disorganization.
Even if the arrows didn't punch straight through the best plate?
They'd find the gaps, the joints, the visor slits, the armpits, or they'd hit the horses. The sheer volume and relentless noise, the thwack of arrows hitting armor all around you. It shattered French morale. They couldn't advance properly, they couldn't fight effectively, and they couldn't even retreat easily because they were jammed in so tightly.
So the arrows basically crippled the French attack before the English infantry even had to get seriously involved.
That's a key point. The archers weren't necessarily winning the battle single-handedly by killing everyone, though they killed many. Their primary role, strategically, was to fix the French in place and thin their ranks.
Fix and thin, I like that.
They pinned them down, disrupted their formations, drained their energy, and broke their will to fight.
Okay.
So when the English infantry, the men-at-arms who were positioned behind the archers, relatively fresh and on firmer ground, finally advanced or counterattacked,
They were engaging an enemy already beaten.
an enemy that was exhausted, disorganized, demoralized, and literally stuck in the mud amongst their own dead and wounded. It was a masterclass in using one part of your army to completely enable the success of another. The whole system worked together.
It really is a perfect synthesis then. You've got the weapon tech, the longbow. You've got the deep training creating the skilled manpower. You've got the smart tactical deployment with the stakes. And you've got the environment, the mud and narrow field exploited perfectly. So pulling this all together, what's the big takeaway? The sources seem really clear. Agincourt wasn't some inexplicable miracle. It was a very calculated military operation.
Designed specifically to maximize the longbow system against a known enemy's weaknesses, their reliance on heavy cavalry in numbers, and their potential vulnerability to terrain.
Henry didn't just bring bows, he brought a whole integrated longbow system to the fight.
Exactly.
And that decisive edge came from using all the bow's strengths, range, that incredible rate of fire, the armor-piercing aspect, but using them together with the defensive stakes.
Yeah.
And that horribly advantageous terrain.
The stakes controlled the space, the mud controlled the pace, and the arrows controlled the enemy's ability to fight.
Which leads to a final thought, perhaps, for you listening.
Yeah, I think it raises a really interesting question. If the success of just one weapon system, the longbow back in the 15th century, needed literally centuries of compulsory national training and a clever battlefield engineering and favorable terrain just to be truly decisive,
Right.
then what similar complex interlocking systems, maybe less visible ones, are absolutely essential for making modern military technology truly effective today? It makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
The lesson from Agincourt maybe isn't just about the bow. It's about the system. The most advanced weapon is sort of useless without the entire human, tactical, and logistical structure built around it, supporting it.
Precisely. It's about the whole package. Always is.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something really fascinating from medieval warfare. It's this tactical puzzle. How could the most expensive, heavily armored force on the battlefield, the mounted knight, be stopped, sometimes completely, by just a sharpened piece of wood? Yeah, we're looking at medieval anti-cavalry stakes, sometimes called palisades. Our sources give us a pretty good picture. So the big question is, how did this, really simple bit of kit give such a massive advantage against pure momentum, against that cavalry charge? Okay, let's get into it.
It's a great example of efficient asymmetric defense, really. And while we often link them to, say, the English longbowmen in the 100 Years' War, these kinds of stakes were actually quite common. Their purpose was pretty clear-cut. Create a quick temporary barrier, specifically to shield missile troops like archers from that initial shock of a cavalry attack.
Right. So to really get how they worked, we need to look at the stakes themselves first, the physical object. These weren't just like random branches they found, were they? The sources seem pretty consistent, about 6 feet long.
Yeah, roughly 6 feet seems to be the standard, and that size is important long enough to be a serious obstacle, but still manageable enough for one person to carry and plant reasonably quickly.
Okay, 6 feet. And one end obviously sharpened to a point, a pretty nasty point, I imagine.
Absolutely lethal, but, focusing just on the sharp end kind of misses some of the cleverness involved in the logistics. What's really interesting is what the sources sometimes mention about the other end, the blunt end.
Ah, right, the ropes. Sometimes they mention ropes tied around that end, or maybe them being bundled. That sounds like it's all about speed and supply, doesn't it? Not decoration.
Exactly. Pure military efficiency. It strongly suggests these things were made beforehand. Not improvised on the spot, maybe prepared during quieter campaign periods, or even on the march. They were likely bundled up, maybe 10 or 12 together, using those ropes. One source mentions this specifically. The ropes let one guy carry a whole defensive section.
Okay, that makes sense. Bundled for carrying.
And not just carrying, those ropes probably helped with planting them too. Gave the soldier something to grip, to pull down with both hands, driving the stake in deeper and faster. Leverage.
Right, leverage. Because you can't just push a 6-foot stake deep into the ground in minutes, especially if the ground's hard, right? Just by hand. So What else did they need? Must have had tools for this.
Oh, absolutely. This is where it goes beyond simple improvisation and into, proper field engineering. If you've got enemy cavalry bearing down on you, time is everything. You need mallets, heavy ones, maybe even specialized sledgehammers. You've got to get thousands of these stakes hammered into the ground across maybe hundreds of yards of front really fast. We're talking minutes.
Wow, okay, so synchronized teams, basically.
Right.
With heavy tools brought along in the baggage train.
Precisely. It requires planning, foresight. That's good generalship, isn't it? Anticipating the need and having the gear ready.
So they're prepared. The tools are ready. The enemy is spotted. Now it's about getting them in the ground. Fast. And you mentioned the genius wasn't just the sharp point, but how they were placed. Yeah. The geometry. They weren't just stuck in vertically like a simple fence. That wouldn't work so well.
No, exactly. A horse might jump a vertical fence or just avoid it. The sources are clear. They were hammered in at an angle, always tilted forwards, towards the enemy.
Towards the charge. Okay, let's talk about that angle. Why was that specific tilt so important? This is where it gets really interesting, the physics of it.
Right. The angle was key. If it's too steep, too vertical, the horse might see it and refuse, or maybe it just breaks the horse's legs without, stopping the momentum instantly. But if it's too shallow, too horizontal, the horse might just step right over it or stumble without being truly disabled.
So there was a sweet spot.
Seems like it. Based on descriptions and analysis, probably somewhere around maybe 45 to 60 degrees from the horizontal. That angle meant the sharp point was relatively low to the ground, often hidden in grass or mud. A charging horse, especially with the rider leaning forward, might not see it clearly until it was way too late.
So the horse's own momentum does the work, driving its chest or legs onto the point.
Exactly. The forward and downward force of the charge maximizes the impalement. Nasty stuff.
Which brings us to Agincourt, the classic example, right? The English longbowmen famously used these. They weren't just hiding behind them. They were basically creating a pre-engineered kill zone.
Precisely. They'd hammer them in quickly just before the action started, creating this dense, angled, interlocking hedge. But it wasn't always just a straight line in front. Often they'd position them in front, yes, but also curve them forward slightly on the flanks of the archer formation.
Okay, so not just a wall, but shaping the battlefield.
Yeah, it did two crucial things. First, obviously, the direct physical protection, stopping the horses. But second, by angling them on the flanks, they helped funnel the charging cavalry into a narrower channel, right into the archer's kill zone.
And disrupts their formation, breaks their momentum.
Exactly. It prevents them from just sweeping around the sides, which is what cavalry often wants to do. It completely ruins the cohesion and shock value of the charge.
Okay, but let's play devil's advocate here. If these stakes were so good, surely the French, or whoever was charging, must have figured out ways around them. Couldn't they just send infantry up first to clear the stakes? Wouldn't that make the stakes more of a problem for the English archers if they needed to advance later? Did the sources mention counter-tactics?
That's a really important point. And the success often depended heavily on the enemy's, their doctrine, how they preferred to fight. The French nobility especially put huge stock in the mounted charge. It was about glory, shock, breaking the enemy line quickly. They often led with cavalry. And crucially, they didn't always coordinate well between their cavalry and their infantry. So yes, in theory, a smart combined arms attack infantry, clearing the way first, could negate the stakes.
But in practice?
In practice, especially in famous cases like Agincourt, the French launched the cavalry charge against the prepared position. And when you add terrain like the deep mud at Agincourt...
Oh, right, the mud. That must have made it even worse.
Absolutely. A horse hits that angled barrier, stumbles, maybe gets wounded, gets tangled in the mud. The whole charge just disintegrates into chaos.
And even if the horse wasn't killed outright, the knight might be forced to dismount.
Precisely. And a heavily armored knight designed to fight from horseback with momentum is suddenly stuck on foot, maybe knee-deep in mud.
Slow, vulnerable.
Exactly. They become much easier targets for the archers who are standing protected behind those very stakes. It's a brilliant system, protection for your own troops, controlling the enemy's movement and making them incredibly vulnerable.
Wow. Okay, so physical barrier, funneling effect, forcing dismounts. But there was more to it, wasn't there? You mentioned a psychological aspect earlier.
Yes, absolutely. Beyond the grim physical reality, the sources hint that these stakes had a powerful psychological effect too.
How so? Why would a static defense mess with the attacker's head so much?
Well, think about what makes a cavalry charge effective. It's speed, it's confidence, it's that feeling of unstoppable momentum, the shock factor. If your cavalry knows, or even just suspects, that there's a hidden or partly hidden line of 6-foot angled, sharpened wood waiting for them, it makes them hesitate.
You have to slow down. Or worry about where exactly the stakes are.
Right. That hesitation, that slight reduction in speed or confidence can be enough to disrupt the whole charge before it even hits the line. And think about the investment. A knight, his training, his expensive armor, his valuable warhorse, risking all of that against essentially a cheap, disposable stick.
Yeah, the cost-benefit looks pretty bad from the knight's perspective.
Immense psychological pressure. So that threat of the stakes, the uncertainty, it could grant a huge defensive advantage before a single arrow flew. It forced the enemy to be cautious, to perhaps reconsider the direct assault.
It puts the defenders in control, dictating the terms of the engagement.
Exactly. It shifts the tactical initiative. Which raises that interesting point about battlefield engineering. Sometimes the perceived danger is almost as effective as the actual physical stopping power.
That really is the core lesson here, isn't it? For you listening, this deep dive shows that the power of these palisades came down to, well, three things working together. First, the preparation and speed, having them ready, bundled with ropes, using tools to plant them fast. Second, the specific geometry, that crucial 45 to 60 degree angle pointing towards the enemy. And third, the smart positioning, not just a wall, but using them to funnel the enemy, protect the flanks, and create that kill zone.
Yeah, it's just a fantastic example of how a simple, low-tech bit of wood, when used correctly with good logistics and tactical thinking, could counter one of the most feared and expensive military assets of the time.
It really underscores the power of smart planning and field logistics, doesn't it? Not just brute force.
It does, and, it kind of challenges our usual ideas about defense. We often think big, massive stone castles, thick plate armor, huge investments. But here you have these cheap, disposable, quick-to-deploy stakes being incredibly effective in major battles. It really makes you think, what other simple, maybe overlooked, low-cost tactics had a disproportionate impact in history? Things like maybe caltrops or the development of the pike square. Simple ideas that dramatically changed battlefield dynamics against seemingly superior forces.
That's a great thought to leave things on. The power of simple ingenuity in high-stakes situations. Definitely something to keep in mind as you look at military history. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. Until next time.